back. This is the Ben Shapiro Show. Joining us on the line is Governor Larry Hogan. He is the 62nd governor of Maryland, overwhelmingly reelected to a second four-year term, receiving the most votes of any Maryland gubernatorial candidate and becoming the only the second Republican governor to be reelected in the 242-year history of the state. His approval ratings are sky high because he is actually a competent governor at a time when such competency is in high demand and low supply. Governor Hogan, thanks so much for joining the show.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Thanks for having me.
So let's begin with the situation in Maryland. At present, what is the situation in Maryland as far as the number of deaths and the COVID-19 infections?
Well, unfortunately, we're just kind of at the ramping up at the beginning of the curve. We're a couple of weeks behind some of the other hot spots, but we're up to 5,529 cases. We were up 1,158 cases just today. We've got more than 100 deaths so far, and in the Washington metropolitan area, if you count Maryland, D.C., and Virginia, we're now well over 10,000 cases. And just 2 weeks ago, we were at 1,000. So, we're starting to ramp up quite a bit.
And when it comes to the sort of resources that are being made available, this obviously has varied widely state by state. My state of California has done a pretty good job marshaling resources such that the hospitals are not overwhelmed. Obviously, New York has been a lot more strained. What's the situation been like in Maryland, and how have you marshaled those resources?
Well, so we very early on, we've been taking it very seriously. So 34 days ago, I declared a state of emergency when we got our very first cases, and then was either the first or second state in the country to close our schools statewide. And we've been taking sort of unprecedented action almost every single day. And we're hoping to stay ahead of the curve so we don't look like New York and that we look a little bit more like, we don't want to get as bad as it got in California, but we want to kind of flatten that curve out like some of the states have done more successfully. It's hard to tell exactly how successful all of those steps we've taken are going to be because we're, as I said, just starting up that hill. But we believe that all of the kind of drastic measures we've had to take are going to save thousands of lives in our state and make it not nearly as bad as it would have been. But marshaling those resources, we're just like the other states that you hear about. We're concerned about that surge, and that's why we want to flatten it out. The surge, if everything happens at the same time, if we didn't take these measures, then we'd be overwhelmed in our ICU beds and we'd have a lack of ventilators. And, we do have the same issues with lack of testing and lack of PPE, the masks and personal protective equipment that everybody's dealing with.
Governor Hogan, what sort of information do you have on the general case fatality rate in Maryland? The case fatality rate has been an area of significant sort of miasmatic misunderstanding. People don't understand what the actual case fatality rate is. We don't know how many people actually have the virus because the only people who are being tested presumably are the people who are coming in who are symptomatic. We now know that lots and lots of people are asymptomatic or experiencing mild symptoms and never get tested. And so it's difficult to tell how many people even have the virus, which does make a difference in terms of getting back to normal. Has there been any discussion in the state of Maryland about doing some sort of widespread randomized testing to find out what percentage of the population already has this thing?
Well, Ben, that's an excellent point. And yes, that's what we've been talking about for about a month. One of the first things I did was I put together a coronavirus response team that was made up of some of the smartest folks in our state, epidemiologists and public health doctors, specialists from places like Johns Hopkins University and the University of Maryland Medical System, all of our top health systems and hospital systems in the state. And we're also home to the NIH and the FDA and things like that. So we got some really smart docs who are looking at all these things. But you're right. Until we get to the point where we can do widespread testing, all of us are flying somewhat blind because no state is really doing enough testing. And the tests are, while we're all doing everything we can at the state and federal level to ramp up that testing, and we're searching for those tests all over the domestic market and all over the world, but there's not enough. And so we've just increased testing fairly rapidly over the past week or two, but still it's not where it needs to be. And so you're right, we're looking at hospitalization rates and then the number of people that go into the hospitals, how many of them go into ICU, how many go onto ventilators, and then what the survival rate is. Those are numbers that we're looking at just to look at the surge and when we're going to run out of the things and what our deaths are going to look like. But in order to get back to normal, we're going to have to know, how many people in our population are actually have the disease and are still transmitting it and infecting other people.
I mean,
so we're still a way from getting there.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that's most difficult is we flattened the curve, and presumably the point of flattening the curve, and it looks like it's being successful not only in New York where the spike was most dramatic, but across the country. We've seen a lot of the models revised downward in terms of prospective number of deaths, which is really, really good news. One of the hard things to tell, though, is flattening the curve doesn't necessarily actually lower the amount of time that people are susceptible to this thing. As we start to release folks back into business areas and into crowds and back to religious events and all the rest, you could see a second wave that dwarfs the first wave, depending on how this works.
Well, Ben, that's also an excellent point, and that's one of the things that you hear folks like Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx talking about. Some of our top docs are concerned about that. The decisions on getting back to so-called getting back to normal or opening up, getting things back open again, is going to be even more difficult than it was to make these, have people make these sacrifices and try to shut things down because we don't want to go back up and have the spike again. It's hard to get that genie back in the bottle, and we're going to have to do widespread testing. We're going to have that capacity before we can let people go back into kind of a normal life, or it's just going to spread again. Everybody's done a great job. I mean, look, the numbers they were talking about on a national level and the potential deaths of up to 2.5 million people, and then they lowered that down. Maybe it's going to be 240,000 down to 100,000, and now it's looking even lower because of all the great actions that everybody's been taking. Everybody's been sacrificing, not just, actions that governors have taken in their states, but the individuals who have, given up and to things, and the small businesses that have closed down and the individuals that stayed home. I mean, it all made a difference, but it'll all be for nothing if we go back out and we spike back up again in, another month or two.